The idea here is, as I mentioned, this is just one of many talks that I'm planning on giving over the next couple of months. And as we are talking about all of this kind of stuff, um, obviously you got to take on board that there's a certain amount of crystal ball gazing here. It's very hard to sort of say what's going to go. So if somebody sort of says, "Well, Gavin said this, and I'm going out and I'm going to go and do something really drastic," like that's not what I don't come coming back to me crying about this. This is just my opinion. I'm doing my best to kind of predict what I see happening in the market, and you know, I've got things wrong before. As if you're listening to my social media and all that, you'll be well aware. I took a terrible beating in 2008. I was very fortunate. The timing in my career. I'm 30 years. I'm actually 31, 32 years in property now. And in that 32 years, property goes up, property goes down, property goes up, property goes down. Most of the time it's going up, but there are periods when it goes down. And when it goes down, it's usually quite a painful period because people have got mortgages. Suddenly your mortgage is maybe worth more than the property is worth. Maybe the payments have gone really high and it's actually higher than the rent you're collecting. But during that period of time, the vast majority of it, the property prices are up and you're feeling like you're on top of the world. But then, when it goes bad, it can go pretty bad. So this is very much a mental game. And that's one of the reasons I started my podcast, is because there is so much of a mental game in this that you really do have to um, be cautious about the way you enter the property market. If you're a person who frets and gets anxious, then you got to ask yourself, is being an investor the way you want to go? Because I know somebody who went and bought an apartment in New York City, and they thought to themselves, this is great. I got it at a great price and all that. And they transferred money over in euros to dollars. And then the dollar euro exchange rate started to fluctuate. And all of a sudden, even though they thought they got a great price, the dollar value went in such a way that they lost about $90,000 in the swing of the currency. Property was still the exact same price they paid for it, but because of the currency exchange, they lost 90,000 in the space of a couple of weeks, and they were like sleepless nights over this. And I remember saying, like, why are you investing in something that has fluctuations if you can't tolerate it? So it's very much try to get an understanding, like try to understand your own mindset, and your own self-awareness is really important. If you're a person who frets about interest rates going up or down or anything like that, and you're going to get sleepless nights, then maybe be careful about getting into this. So the way this works is, I'll just bring you into the agenda for tonight. We're talking about timing the market, and we're talking about, initially I'm going to be going in and I'm talking about what is impacting the prices. Then as we go through it, there's various other things I'm going to talk about. Speaking of what's impacting the prices, so most of you will be aware that you're reading in the newspapers, house prices are going up, rents are going up. Then there's kind of announcements that we're extending the rent pressure zone across the entire country. And then there's a talk about March of 2026, this new law coming in that gives people 6 years. All of this fluctuates the market here in Ireland, but specifically to Ireland, those particular rules. There is other stuff that impacts the market that's nothing to do with those things that you're hearing about. And we'll just talk about it here. Like the first thing, the most obvious thing is interest rates. All right. Interest rates, the bank are charging. Property prices tend to be inversely correlated. Now, that's just a fancy way of saying the opposite. Okay. So when interest rates are, we'll say interest rates are up here, very, very high. And if they, like the ECB drops the rates, and then they say, okay, we're going to drop the rate again. Oh, let's drop the rate again. And this kind of thing happens over a period of time. They bring their interest rates down, and then suddenly it says, okay, where everything is good. And then what happens is, oh, inflation has crept back into the market. Oh, we're going to have to increase again. And oh, inflation is much worse than we expect. Suddenly they're going up quicker. Now, in that time period, that might be 3 or 4 years of time. Property prices, when interest rates are high, property prices tend to be low. And then every time there's an interest rate, it makes the property cheaper to finance. Most people buy property not with cash, but with borrowings from the bank. And so it's completely connected to the value. And you might go and take out a loan and you might have a fixed rate. So that fixed rate protects you from these swings. But generally speaking, when people are looking at buying a property, they're looking at it at a period of time when the market is doing something, okay, and the interest rates are somewhere. So this will actually push prices up. Every time interest rates come along, it generally tends to push prices up. And so you'll get to this point where if you go back and look at the COVID prices, I'll just let somebody in here. During the COVID lockdowns, interest rates actually went to zero. Let's just call that zero, all right? And they actually went negative for people who had surplus funds. I know somebody, very wealthy entrepreneur, and he had something like 3 million in cash in the bank, and it was costing him something like 70 grand a year in reverse interest payments to keep his money in the bank. Like instead of getting paid for keeping the money, he was being penalized for keeping money. That's what happens when you get into minus rates. But what happened during that period of time, when interest rates are really, really low and when they go negative, people with lots of cash, what do? Do they want to pay negative interest rates? And actually, the bank is charging them to keep? Of course not. They want to go and invest in the market. So property prices will go up. Stock prices, stock market prices will go up. Everything goes up as rates go down. And so that's something to bear in mind. That's most definitely going to impact this, your interest rates. Now, there's a thing called your yield. And the yield, it can cause all sorts of confusion when you start talking about yield. But in the simplest terms, if I buy a property for 100 grand and I collect every year from it 10,000 a year, then the yield from that property is 10%. So 100K to buy the property, I collect 10 grand a year in rent, it's a 10% yield, all right? Interest rates and yields are all interconnected. So the more the rates go down, the higher the yields, usually. But then the market moves as well to kind of counteract that. The next thing that impacts prices is supply demand. Now, that is the one thing that's really impacting the Irish market. We have got so much demand and we have so little supply. We have the hangover from 2008 is that loads and loads of construction companies went wallop. Loads of people moved abroad either for a couple of years or for life. And what happens is a young guy or a young girl moves abroad because, you know, economically they have to go and get work somewhere else. What happens when they're away? They meet somebody and that person is from another country. Next minute, their economic base changes altogether and they don't come back. And that's what happened in Ireland. We had tens of thousands of people working in the construction sector. And then we had 4 years when there was just nothing happening. Like the crash of 2008 meant that you had to accept long-term unemployment or get in a plane and go somewhere else. And that's what a lot of people chose to do, go somewhere else. I have a friend who chose long-term unemployment and I mean, it wasn't pretty. Himself and his wife were both drawing the dole, but they had some savings and thankfully, they had a low enough mortgage that the dole and everything and their savings, they could kind of get by. But how long can you do that for before the stress gets to you and stuff? So a lot of people vacated and just left the country. And what that did was reduce the capacity and your ability to build has reduced with that. So in 2008, or we'd say 2007, let me just move this thing. In 2007, right, we were doing 80,000 housing. In fact, it was 85,000 housing units a year. Okay. That's the construction sector was able to deliver that. By 2012, that had fallen to 8,000 units. So 1/10. That was how much of a capacity was being built. And the problem is when there's so little happening, businesses go bankrupt, people leave the industry, they either move abroad or they retrain and work elsewhere. So I know a lot of people, plumbers, electricians, they decided, you know what, screw this. I'm not going to wait around for this. I'm going to go and get a job working for Facebook or something like that. So people went and did that. Other people decided, I'm going to go back to university. I don't want to be a Sparky anymore, but I could be an electrical engineer. So when the recession is over, I'll actually have a qualification. I can work in an office rather than a site. So people did that. But we're currently in a situation now today where we're trying to get to 40,000 units, to like still less than half of where we were. Let me just let these people in. The fact that we are only able to do less than half of the amount we were doing in 2007. But we're only delivering about 30,000. The government's saying they want to deliver 40,000 this year. They're nowhere near it. They're just not going to do it. The actual capacity that we should be delivering is we're at 40. In order to meet demand, we should be at around 80. So we should be back up in 2007's level. That's how much we need to be building just to keep prices stable. And because we're not doing that, this is the difference. All of this demand looking for a house. So you can imagine going out there looking to buy a property. What's happening? You're bidding on that property against 7 or 8 other people. And those people are most likely buying it for themselves to move into as a home. If you're an investor, it's very difficult to bid against somebody who's buying a home. There's an emotional driver for buying a home. I want my kids to go to that school. I want to be near my parents. I grew up in this area. This is where all my friends live. I want to live here. A lot of economic reasons that an investor will want to get it, like a certain return on his investment, wants to make sure he buys with good value. None of that factors into the family that are looking for a home. They're thinking about totally different emotional drivers. And so they'll pay more than an investor. And so it's hard to compete. And that is one of the big things. This thing here, the supply demand tension is massive. And that is driving it up. Now, in addition to that, we have planning system delays, right? When you go for planning permission, you're looking at what's supposed to be an 8-week decision, okay? And then 4 weeks for appeals. So it should take you no more than 12 weeks to go and get planning permission. But what happens is people go in for planning and then somebody objects. If somebody objects, like let's say it's a neighbor you don't get on with or whatever, or it's a neighbor that says, I don't want this guy building 4 houses at the back of my house or whatever. They object. That puts you then into the appeals process, which adds 12 months to your process. So the amount of projects that are tied up at the moment in the planning system is crazy. Now, that's just projects that should be delivered that are not getting delivered. There's also the problem of zoning and zoned land and service land and all that. I won't go into that. Another thing driving up prices, cost of construction. Cost of construction is actually divided into 2 things. There's just the cost that went up after COVID, huge increases in the cost of labor, huge increases in the cost of materials. And we saw that. We were building sites and stuff like that. And like the cost of bricklaying jumped up from between 2022 and 2023, like huge, like doubling of in prices. Um, Timber frame construction, massive increase in that. So as a result, house prices went up. Now, at the same time, this supply demand tension actually pushed up prices as well. So the cost of construction was kind of at least compensated by the rise in prices. The next thing, and this is something that's very much in the news a lot, net migration figures. Okay. Migration is the inward and outward movement of people. And it's a nuanced thing. If you go back to the 1980s, like when I was in school, you were people that went to university, as soon as they qualified, the next thing they did was get on an airplane to go somewhere else. There was no jobs in Ireland. Most people got on a plane and went to America or went to the UK or went to Canada or Australia. That was the only options you opened. Then around the 1990s, suddenly things started to improve and our employment started to go up. Big American funds, companies used to come in, Google, Facebook, Intel, all those big firms come in. And now you have inward migration is much, much greater. And what happens there is every year there's something like, I think it's something like 50,000 people die. Okay. So the population goes down by about 50,000, but about 70,000 people are born. Okay. So there's an increase of about 25,000 every year. Now, those 25,000, they're babies, but they will grow up over 20 years and to the point where they need property. So the people that were born 20 years ago are now going to university and looking for student accommodation and stuff. So that's factoring into the figures. But not just that, you also have got then huge amounts of people that are coming in from the EU. You've got people that are coming in from, say, the Mediterranean countries, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, all those southern Mediterranean countries. A lot of them are, struggling with unemployment and all that kind of stuff. And so guys will come here to Ireland where they know they can get a job working for one of the big tech firms. And in addition to that, salaries are better here. And even though house prices are higher, you're generally speaking better off. So a lot of people are coming for that reason. So that the amount of people that are leaving Ireland to counter that is far less. There might be 20,000 people leaving, but there might be 40,000 people coming in. So you've got 25,000 more people born, and you've got about 40,000 more people that have actually come in because of migration. And so then add to that, you've got the the war in Ukraine drove a huge numbers of people into this country, like refugee status, and then you've also got there's a lot of controversy around the asylum seekers now and all that kind of stuff. Last year, something like 140,000 people came into the country, and of that, only about 50,000 left or died. And as a result, there's about 90,000 more people in the country this year than there was the previous year. Where do those people live? Like, we already have a housing crisis for the last couple of years, but now we have an additional 90,000 people on top of what already was a housing crisis. So you can see why prices keep going up, rents keep going up, pressure keeps going up on the housing sector. This one here, rent and regulations, that is, I talked a little bit about the fact that March 2026, everything is changing next year when it comes to this stuff. The government are bringing in, they're trying to kind of fix the situation. But one of the biggest problems with fixing the situation is that you can make tweaks that don't work initially, or but you don't know that they're not working. And so it can be a while before you realize, oh shit, that didn't work. Now, they went and they said, okay, the rent pressure zones in certain towns around the country, they were talking about possibly abolishing them at one stage. And then I heard that Carlow and Castlebar had been added to the rent pressure zone. And I was like, that's strange. They're talking about abolishing them one month, and then they're adding two more the next month. And then a month later, they decided the entire country is now under a rent pressure zone. And so what that's done is it means that you're restricted on the amount you can increase your rent by. And people don't like restrictions. But in addition to that, in March next year, that's the big day. March 2026, that is when the new landlord tenant rules come in. And what they're going to be doing is it means that anybody who signs a lease in your property from March of next year, you are going to have 6 years guaranteed tenancy rights. And so what's that going to mean? Well, that means that if you decide 2 years into your thing that, you know what, I think I'll just sell the property and I'll do something else. Now you're selling it with a tenant living in it. And that tenant doesn't have to leave for another 4 years. And you're selling it. How many people are going to buy that property with an in situ tenant? That's something that can be quite difficult. You can imagine that there's a lot of people out there buying property at the moment who are buying it as a home, but they're not looking to buy it as an investment. If you're selling a property with a sitting tenant, you can imagine that there's not going to be so many people interested in that property. So a lot of people are now deciding to get out quickly before that happens. And we've noticed an increase in the amount of investors exiting the market. And that's at the end of the day, it boils down to investor sentiment. Like all of these different rules, all of these different things that are impacting the market, they ultimately have an impact on investor sentiment. And the investor sentiment might be, you know what, this is a load of bullshit. I'm not going to bother with this. I'm getting out. Or 10 years from now, are we going to have fixed the housing crisis? Probably not. What's that going to do? Push up prices. So 10 years from now, I'll have property that's gone up in value, that's worth more, and that the rents are likely going to be higher, even though there might be all sorts of regulation in the middle of that. So look, that's one of the things. Let's get into whether you should try to time the market or whether you should just stay in the market and just get in. If you go back to 2008, there was a huge crash. Prices fell by about 70%. I was badly impacted by that. The previous drop in prices had been around about 2000, 2001, when the dot-com crash came. And what that did is it had a softening effect on the market, but it didn't cause a crash. 2008 was a really serious crash. Banks stopped lending, investors got burnt, hundreds and thousands of people went bankrupt. I was hanging on by the skin of my teeth for about 6 years trying to just survive. It was very, very difficult. And a lot of people who bought in 2012, if you bought in 2012, you've done insanely well. You've probably doubled, if not trebled, your money in some cases. And so you might kind of say, geez, I'd like to go and buy a property and see it go up by triple. Why don't I just wait until the market is low and then I'll jump in? The problem is that over the past, if you look at historical information, over the past 50 years, 80 to 90% of each decade, property prices have been rising. So if you're waiting to time the market, you're only going to catch like 10%. Like there's going to be 1 year out of 10 where you're actually able to get the low prices. If you decide that you're going to wait for that low market, you could be waiting 8 or 9 years. And in that period of time, you could miss out on a lot of potential upside. So I think it's probably wiser to just look for the economics of a deal that's stack and then just buy it if it makes sense. But don't speculate. One of the big problems with 2008, the only thing people wanted to do in 2008 was buy for 100 and then keep it for a year and sell for 200 or maybe 175. There was huge increases in prices. And so what happened was, let's say that's what you're thinking, okay? So you go and speak to the bank and the bank say, oh, we're going to charge you 7%. So you're saying, okay, I'll borrow 100K and I'll pay 7%. So at the end of a year, I'll have paid 107 and I'll sell and I'll make 93K profit. Happy days. Why don't I just do that? I don't care about anything else. And then you'd be thinking about, well, what does it cost? If 7 grand is the interest, what does it actually cost? How much rent would you collect? What happened in pre-2008 is people, because they were focused on this, the only thing they cared about was that. And they thought, you know what? If the rent I can collect in that period of time is just 3 or 4, that's fine, because I'm going to end up making 93. And so what they would do is they'd say, yeah, let's do that. Then what happened is the crash took place and these guys are suddenly now, okay, I have to hold this property long term, like 6 or 7 years. I better go and, pay my interest and just pay every year. Suddenly they realize, oh shit, I have to pay 7, but I'm only collecting 3 or 4, let's say 4. So now in order to stay in that property, they had to find 3 from somewhere else. Now, I'm using 100 here. That could be a 900,000 property. So obviously these figures are all, tens of thousands and stuff. But that is the simplification of what happened in pre-2008. People were so focused on this profit that they didn't look at this figure and they didn't have the ability to stay in the property, renting it and paying their interest. They started having to take money out of their pocket from salary and whatever else they were doing. And what happens in that situation, whenever you have a situation where, let's say you own your own home and your home is here and you have a mortgage on that, you live there and you don't want to be forced out. So if you're under pressure, let's say you have a second property over here, you're standing here and you're saying, right, I can't afford these 2 mortgages. Which one is the more important? Do I pay this one that's a rental property, or do I pay the one that I actually live in? Of course, people chose this one. And what happened was rental properties suddenly went down in value because nobody wanted them. Because everyone was saying, if the bank come after me for this one, I don't give a shit because I'm just forgetting about that. But if the bank come after me for this one, I'm in deep shit because that's my home. The kids are going to be out of, the school that they're in. Wife's going to be unhappy, etc., etc. So that is what happened. People decided to prioritize their home over rental and income property. And so the market collapsed, 70% fall. You might think, okay, let's go and buy at that price. But as I mentioned, typically prices are rising 80 to 90% of each decade for the last 50 years. And so the chances of you timing it are kind of slim. A typical market cycle is 7 to 10 years. So if you're waiting for a crash, you could be waiting quite a while. We're currently 18 years since 2008, 2000 thereabouts, or we're 17 years since 2008. Like that's a long time now that the prices have been kind of rising. So anyway, let's go on to the next thought. If you're looking at this and you're kind of thinking to yourself, what's next? 2008, that's where the prices fell. And then from 2008 to 2012 or 13 or so. It was about 5 years. Prices went down, down, down. They went really bad. And then after that period, it was around about 2014. I remember a property sold and it sold for higher than the predicted price. And I was like, oh, wow, what's going on here? And that was when the market started to rise again. So anyone who got in 2014 has done really, really well. And the prices kept going. Then what did we have? 2020. That's a pivotal moment because COVID. Now, it's funny, that's around the time that I started the podcast. And I started it because 2020 with COVID, the lockdown, everything like that, it seemed very similar to 2008. Economically, a lot of people were very worried. People lost their jobs, people were being furloughed, people were working from home, not knowing what was going on. And so I kind of thought there's going to be a big price drop and now's going to be a good time to buy. So that was my assumption. But the European Central Bank, the Fed in America, the Bank of England, everyone saw the same as we saw. And they said, you know what? We can't have panic like this. So what did they do? They reduced interest rates way, 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 way down, like to zero. And what did that do? Well, it threw a lifeline to the property market. And so rather than falling like I expected, it went on a tear because people now could buy a house and they were paying like 1% interest, 2% interest. And so that's happened. If you were thinking to time the market, I have this story. I bought a house out in Carrickmines, or I built some houses in Carrickmines, and I can remember hearing the story about this guy. And what he did was he owned this house and he wanted to buy a bigger, nicer house. And he thought to himself, I'm going to, it's 2020. I think there's going to be a crash in prices. What am I going to do? I'm going to go and I'm going to sell my home and I'm going to move into rented accommodation and I'm going to rent. And while I'm renting, I'll have this pot of money ready to go for when the market crashes. And then I'll be able to buy a nice house over here at less than the price that I sold my house. How do you think that went for the guy? Instead, he's been in here renting and prices have gone like this. So he is now in a situation where he cannot afford to buy his old property that he sold. It has now gone higher than he has the ability to afford. That's what he did. That's what timing the market cost him. So as much as the price, as attractive as it might look to, to let there be a downfall in the market and then buy, there's so much uncertainty as to when that will take place. And if you already own a home and you're thinking of making that trade, it's very risky. You could be caught like this guy where you can't even afford the house that you sold. And so I think the way to do it is to just study how property works, study all of the different factors that influence prices, and then go and look at deals. And if you're interested in building a property portfolio, then have a look at the different components that make up a good house price deal. And I'll go into some of those as we're talking this evening. Let me just go into, here it is here. So where are we going with the market? Like if we look ahead a couple of years, you might sort of say, here we are today. We know that demand continues to rise. So there's still more people coming into the country, and there's the Central Statistics Office. If you look up the CSO, you go online, cso.ie, they have all these predictions of where the population is going to be going over the next number of years. And those population statistics, they are estimating that in the next 20 years, there's going to be in the region of 6 million, 6.5 million people living in Ireland, and like huge inward migration into the country. What's that going to do? It's going to push demand even higher. And at the moment, we're unable to accommodate the current problems with the supply. And so it's just going to get worse by the looks of it. So that's the first thing to think about. And then if you think about this here, the supply, like supply is going to continue to be under pressure because more people, they're not fixing the housing crisis. They're not able to. Planning law, unless it gets changed, and they haven't been able to do that. They might make tweaks around the edges, but they've not really done very well. Increasing the capacity, how are you going to do that? If you wanted to increase the amount of people working in construction, you might go and say, hey, everyone, Eastern Europe, India, Pakistan, all of these countries where there's lots and lots of labor. You say, guys, come to Ireland and we'll let you earn anything in construction completely tax free. And you can imagine we'd have tens of thousands of people coming into the country to work. Where would they stay? Is there accommodation for the current population, let alone introducing thousands more? So it's going to be very, very difficult to fix this housing crisis. So I think 10 years from now, this is still going to be the situation. So if we know that that's the situation, then property is probably going to continue to go up. However, you've always got to be careful. And this goes back to the previous slide when we talked about, interest rates going up and you're unable to cover the rent. The rent is unable to match the interest rate. In the next year or two, there could be a period of difficulty, and you've got to weigh up the risks. I don't think the risks are necessarily to do with the property market. A lot of people look at 2008 and they say, oh, there was a huge crash. That's going to happen again. But you have to wonder, do the same, factors that caused that then, do they exist today? In 2008, people were speculating. They were not, they were not thinking about, I want to buy a property for my home. They were thinking about, I want to buy a property because I want to flip it and I want to make this, big profit. That's why they were, at the time that that was going on, the banks were throwing money at you. Okay. Banks were very, very loose. I can remember borrowing to buy a property, and I borrowed 110% of the value of the property. The banks were willing to give me 110% of the funds that I needed. And that meant that I could buy the property outright for cash, and I could also pay for my legal fees and the taxes and things like that. 100% covered. No cash from me, all from the bank. Today, what does it look like? You guys, you're out there, you're trying to get mortgages and stuff. Is it easy? Like, you're talking about, if you're buying a home, you can get up to 90%. But if you're an investor, the most they'll give you is 70%. Compare that with good old days, 110%, where things are much, much more controlled now than they were. You have the Irish Central Bank, and the Irish Central Bank is saying that you're not allowed to borrow more than 4 times your salary. And it has to be based on, the amount of income that you have and your family and all that kind of stuff. So all of these rules are factored in. None of that was happening here. And that's why the banks got into so much difficulty. So if there was some sort of an economic crash, I don't think you're looking at, like, what might happen is demand might soften, but you're still going to have a big problem with your supply. And that's one of the big issues that we have here. I don't think that you're going to get into a situation like what happened in 2008, when all of a sudden this was happening to demand. I could be wrong, but my educated guess is that there will be pressure on prices for the next couple of years. Now, this period here is the most important one. This is the next, say, for the next year, I think things are going to be fine. But it's always hard to say 2 to 3 years out. It's very hard to know what's going to happen, because the world can be a different place very quickly. I mentioned 2001, my honeymoon, in the World Trade Center was attacked, and all of a sudden the buildings came down, world changed very, very quickly. When you think about it like that, you kind of think to yourself, okay, that being the case, let's say AI was to crash, or the stock market was to crash, or something was to crash. That's the bit that you don't know. Let's say Donald Trump loses the head again and decides that he's going to increase tariffs even more. Let's say he decides to attack Ireland as this tax haven in the view of America, and say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to go and we're going to put an extra levy on any American company that's based in Ireland because we want to get them back here. That could all have like a difficult economic impact in the kind of 2 to 3 year period. But if, as long as you can get through that period, you should get then to this, and then it should continue, I would think, to go up. So from that point of view, it's the short-term stuff that you have to think about. If this is where you really don't know what's around the corner, that could directly impact you. But usually it's a short-term kind of a thing. Now, who's buying and selling? This is an important one. Owen Riley, you guys who follow social media, I'm sure you've come across Owen Riley. I had him on my podcast a while back. I know Owen. He sold a property for me in the worst, like 2010 or 2011, I sold something, and he had just set up his business. So I was one of the first clients he had. And he's gone on to do really well. He started in the recession, and then it just started to grow, and his business is, he's got a good business now. And what was really interesting is he recently came out with a report. He does a report every quarter. And in that quarter, he talks about the period of the last 3 months, how has the property prices performed and all that kind of stuff. And what was really interesting in its recent report, so this is for, as far as I know, the report was for July, August, September. All right. So that would be quarter three. And he said that of all of the properties that they sold, he said the vast majority of the sellers were, I think it was 69%, were landlords getting out. And of the amount of people that were selling, he said only about 27 or something like that percent were families selling. Mostly what was happening was, if there was that was somebody had just bought a home and they're selling their home so that they can afford their new home. But 69% were landlords exiting the market. 27% people, they've bought one property, they're selling theirs so they can move into it. That's the purpose of the selling. But what's interesting is so many more landlords selling. This big wedge up here is selling, and then a smaller wedge is selling when it comes to the families. Now, on the buying side, it's completely the opposite. At the moment, all of the buyers in the market, according to Own, 92% of all purchases were families buying a home. How many investors? 8%. 8% of houses purchased in those 3 months were landlords. So you can see landlords are selling and they're not buying. And so there's a really big swing. And a lot of what everyone is kind of putting this down to is March 2026. It's the fear of the unknown, fear of what's going to happen, what's going to happen in the next few months. And so I think that is the bit where it's having this impact on the market. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens next. Now, if we have a look, there's a concept that is quite interesting, and it's called the market clock. And what this does is, whenever you're thinking about investing in property, you have to think about where on the market clock are you. You guys, obviously, that, you're used to your clock looking like that. In this case, the market clock, it works like this. The top of the clock is the boom, peak prices. And the bottom is some sort of a crash, lowest prices. And when you're over on this side, what's happening is prices are falling. And when you're on this side, prices are rising. And so where are we on the property clock? That's the bit. And this is like this is like the crystal ball gazing, essentially. If you think about it like this, because of the March 2020 situation, a lot of people are kind of thinking, I'm going to get out of the market. And so we might be here. Prices are good at the moment, but in March of next year, is that going to cause, prices to fall? Who knows? It's a difficult one. The other thing then is, if supply is going to continue to be as bad as it is, and if demand is going to continue to be as good, as high as it is, then maybe we're actually just over here and it'll keep on going up. It's very hard to say. See, the Central Statistic Office, it's forecasting something like 6.5 million people over the next 20 years. So like that's 500,000 more people, or 1 million more people in the next. So where on the clock are we? You guys, I would love to know. Enter into the chat there if you can. Where do you think we are on the clock? Do you think we're at 12? Do you think we're at 3? Do you think we're at 6? Or do you think we're at 9? And just put in a number in the chat if you have a thought on that. And we'll just see. Petrus thinks 9. iPad 9, 9, 9. Yeah, very interesting. You see, this is the interesting thing about this is what we call sentiment, investor sentiment. You're in a situation where most people listening in here believe prices are going to continue to rise. And so that's it. There's an interesting fact. Above 9 and below 12. Yeah. Neil thinks it's around 11. There's a lot of people that will have, but you can see that the vast majority of people who've answered so far to there are saying that we're in this kind of area, mostly in this area. So we still have some more upside to go. So interesting. Now, what I want to talk about is a very interesting concept. And this is one that, as much as, I found it kind of unusual as a concept, it'd be wrong for me not to talk about this. But it's called the 18-year property cycle, right? And the way it's, the concept is supposed to go is that there is every time there is a boom bust kind of a situation, it's usually an 18-year cycle. And what they say is that there is a crash, and the crash, let's say this is the crash will take 4 years. And that period, like from the moment people say there's a crash to the end of the crash, when the prices stop falling, it's about 4 years. And then you move to a period when prices start to grow. And it's a period of 7 years when prices are growing. And then after that, the prices have gone up, and you get to this point where you're entering kind of hyper demand, or basically it's no longer growing slowly and gradually. It's kind of entering into potentially bubble territory. All right. People don't know for sure if it's a bubble, but that's generally speaking what they've seen over 18 years. So I remember somebody wrote to me on social media and said, Gavin, what do you think of the 18-year property cycle? I was like, that's bullshit. Think about all of the factors: supply, demand, interest rates, political pressure, events around the world, the economy. There's so many things that could impact it. You sort of say to yourself, this seems like shit, bullshit to me. But then I kind of thought about it some more, and I went, okay, let's have a look at it. If we look at 2008 as the beginning of the crash, and if that was to take 4 years, that would take you to 2012, which, having lived this experience, I would say it's actually, it's probably about right. So that got me thinking. And then it said there was the slow growth. And I can remember because I was starting to buy at this stage, and it took about 7 years. And that would take you from 2012 to 2019. What happened in 2020? So that actually is about right, 2012 to 2019. And then they say you enter into bubble territory. And if 2019 is when that began, and if it takes 7 years, then that would suggest that 2026 could be the next crash. And you kind of wonder, geez, is that correct? I remember thinking to myself, 18-year property cycle, 2026. Now, the thing is putting it down on a paper doesn't make it a fact. So instead, what I decided to do was go backwards and say, okay, let's work backwards from the last one. Okay. So if the last crash was 2008, let's subtract 7 years, and it goes back to 2001. And that was this kind of like inflated period. And I was thinking to myself, geez, that is funny, because 2001 is when I actually started getting into some property deals at really good prices. And it was because the dot-com crash. So it was the dot-com crash of around 99, 2000. That's when that happened, okay? So we'd say 2001, and then go back another 7 years. And that brings you back to about 1994. And if 1994 was the beginning of the rise, that actually also tallies. And it kind of makes you think, this is interesting. It does also kind of work within the figures. And so then when was the previous crash to that, I wonder? And I worked backwards. And if you go back 4 years, so it would say that the crash was from 1990 to 1994. And if you go back and have a look at the figures, it actually kind of around that time, it was 1989, there was the currency crisis in the UK because the Bank of England was forced to exit the European exchange rate mechanism or whatever it is. And it was the time when George Soros, the billionaire, he was supposed to have made like 400 million or whatever profit that day, the day that he forced the Bank of England out. And it caused interest rates to go flying up. And what, as I mentioned already, when interest rates go really high, that's when property prices are forced down. And so I don't want to predict 2026 as the crash, but based on these, it does make you kind of wonder. It kind of fits. So it did make me take note of it. And I thought, look, I'll share it here just because, I don't want to be on one side or the other. I want to say, as an investor, your job as an investor is not to speculate on what's going to happen next. It's to kind of just look at the deal and work out what's the best. So it's all about balancing the risks. All right. If you want to look at a property deal, you've got to weigh up what are the risks. Okay. And we mentioned, okay, obviously the AI market is currently a big risk. That could actually weigh down the market. Other things that like regulation, that could have an impact. And it seems to be having an impact. Talking about March 26. The other things that could have an impact on the market, what could they be? AI potential crash, like the dot-com crash of 2000, of 99, 2000. AI looks remarkably like that at the moment to me. And so I kind of feel like there could be an AI crash, and there's a lot of people talking about it. And if that does take place, what's that going to do? It could well cause the market to change, and it could make people nervous. It could make people kind of decide to exit the market. And when you think about that, you kind of wonder, those are some definite risks. But then on the other side, you've got supply constraint. Supply is going to continue to be constrained for the next number of years. So there's at least a decade of constraint, if not more. And then in addition to that, we have got so much demand. The demand is coming from inward migration. And there's so much inward migration that in fact, there is a general view, and this is an interesting fact, is that if you look at the population statistics for Ireland, from the famine, from the time of the famine in 1840, we'll say 7, thereabouts, the population back then was 8.5 million in Ireland. And after the famine, the population was something like 3.5 million. So huge, millions of people died in the famine and relocated in the famine and everything. And it has taken something close to like 180 years for the population to get back to what it was way back in 1847. And so what's happened is there was a one point during the 1950s where the Irish economy was so bad that what actually was happening was everyone was leaving, everyone was going to America or Canada or Australia or the UK. And there was periods of time when they actually thought that Ireland could completely empty out and that it would just be an uninhabited island, basically, with a couple of old people living there, but nobody else. And so this is an interesting thing. Around about the 1970s, what happened was they did the CSO was doing these studies about the population, and in the 1970s they found that there was a 3 to 4 birth rate. Okay, so what it meant was that for every one female, there was on average 3 to 4 children being born to that one female. And today, that figure in 2025 is 1.5. And so what that means is that the population is actually declining. For the population to grow, it has to be above 2. And so our population as Irish-born people is in decline. But what is bringing people into the country is the inward migration. And it's coming from other EU states, and it's coming from outside of the EU. And it is also coming from, obviously, the refugee situation and the fact that we have asylum seekers and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to get into anything controversial. I'm just saying these are facts. This is actually one of the things that is pushing up house prices and all that. Um, so what are the risks? Your job as an investor is to weigh up the risks. And if you look at what you have the rent regulation, you have the March 2026, you have the fact that RPZ has been extended to the entire country. You have the fact that we have got we also have the fact that they're talking about getting rid of short-term rentals. So you won't be able to do you won't be allowed to do Airbnb, certainly in certain parts of the country. All of this creates risk. But you have to ask yourself, is that risk long-term or short-term? And if you look at regulation, that's going to impact sentiment. There are a load of people currently trying to get out of the market. We went through the figures a few minutes ago. 92% of sellers are landlords at the moment. 90, no, sorry, 8% of buyers are landlords. 92% are families. 70% of people selling are landlords exiting the market. And only 23% are exiting the market that are actually like people that are basically trading and moving up. So there's most definitely an impact of these regulations. But in my view, regulations and the March 26 deadline, that's kind of next year. And after that, you're going to have things regularize again. And when they regularize, then it'll probably be these things over here that start to impact prices and stuff. And so that being the case, this is probably more of a short-term issue. These are long-term. So as long as you can find a good property that's paying you a decent enough rent, that you're not too close to the interest rate, you should be fine. If your plan is to build a portfolio for long-term income, that over, most people are not buying real estate to flip in a year's time. Most people are saying, I'm 30 years of age. Like I speak to a lot of clients that come in to get coached by me. I'm 30 years of age. By the time I'm 50, I'd like to be in a position where I could actually potentially retire. I'd like to have 10,000 a month coming in net income from the property portfolio. And that would leave me comfortable. I could actually have a family. I could cover all my expenses and I wouldn't actually have to work. I could just have the rental income coming in. And so people are thinking to themselves, that sounds like a pretty good deal. That's 20-year horizon. So 20 years from now, that's quite achievable. But if you're thinking, oh, I'm just going to buy a property and I'm going to flip it, well, then all of this stuff over here could well have an impact on you. And so you could buy something thinking you're going to flip it next year and then find you're in some sort of a short-term downturn. You're going to be having to hold on to the property for 2 or 3 years. You might not be in a position to do that. Maybe you've borrowed the money. Maybe the money you've borrowed is expensive. All of these things have an impact. And so you have to think longer term when it comes to property. And when it comes to property, what are the things you're looking at? Rent, you're looking at, I mean, there's a lot of different things, factors that come in when I'm looking at buying a property. I look at location. I'm thinking to myself, how far away is it from a main employer? So let's say I buy a house in the middle of a countryside, I might get a good price, but how far is it to bring kids to school? How far is it to go to the shops to buy, a pint of milk or some eggs or some bread or whatever? Um, is there a bus outside? Like, what's the public transport situation like? What are the amenities like in the area? Is there schools? Is there shops? Is there libraries? All that kind of stuff. All of this factors into it. And then who is your tenant going to be? Where are the tenants coming from? One of the reasons that people in my group will buy near a hospital is because nurses and doctors always need accommodation. They're always paid. You don't find nurses unemployed or doctors unemployed. If you look at a college, you can find a college. College or hospital, those are pretty guaranteed to be able to find people for your accommodation. Um, and those are the things. Then you got to look at obviously the regulations and the laws and things like that. That can maybe impact, but generally speaking, these are the key things. And then the rental income versus the interest rate. Okay, if your interest rate one of the things that I like to do is I like to keep a bit of a margin. So if you want to work out the yield on your property, you take your 100 grand property. If you're collecting 10 grand a year in rent, your yield is 10%. That would be a pretty decent deal because you're probably borrowing from the bank at 5%. So you have a difference. You're paying out 5, but you've got 10, you're collecting 10. So there's a kind of a buffer there of about 5%. Now, some of the guys in the group the guys that I'm coaching, they will actually, some of them have gone out and found properties 19 to 25% yield. Now that's a really tasty deal because you're still paying 5 or 6%, but you've now got all of this extra buffer. And that means that it's cash flowing really, really well. And the more cash comes in, you can spend it either buying the next property or you can use it to pay down the loan that you have or whatever it is. So try to get your yield as high as possible. And one of the ways we often do that is HMO. And I see James asked the question about the HMO, which I'll get back to. Now, when you're getting into doing a property deal, what you need to be thinking about is three different lenses. And you're thinking about what are the market fundamentals, what are the deal fundamentals, and then what are my personal fundamentals. And this is just the reason I look at this is because I'm kind of thinking to myself, first of all, where's the market going? At the moment, the market is there is huge demand. There is very, very, very poor supply. So that's going to push up prices. Interest rates are currently pretty low. That's pretty good as well. So just looking at those three things, the market fundamentals look good. What could be negative? Okay, this talk about regulation, the March 26th thing, question mark around that. Is there a potential for AI to come in and screw us all up next year? Could Donald Trump screw us all up? Like, I don't know about that. I do know that this demand supply is not going to change in the next decade. Interest rates, perhaps, that could change. There could be a reason for interest rates, but generally speaking, they move slowly. So I know this for sure is going to impact, is a good market fundamental. This stuff here is kind of maybe short term. So the market fundamentals look pretty good. Then the next thing you look at is the deal fundamentals, okay? Price. When you're looking at buying a property, what price are you paying for it? You might sort of say, well, it is what it is. It's on the the Daft website, or it's in BidX1, or it's in the Lisney website, or it's on the window of that agent down the road that I'm walk by every day and I see the price. But what you always need to do is you need to look at what we call comps, okay? The long name is comparable evidence, but we say comps. What that is go and have a look at if you're buying, let's say, a 4-bed with a nice garden on this street, how many other properties on that street are there for sale? And can you find comparable evidence of prices that were paid recently? Can you find rents that are, that you're aware of? Because that's the next thing. What's the price comparable to others? What are the rents? You don't know when you're looking at buying a house and you're going to rent it out. You don't know for sure, is that house going to rent at a certain price? But what you can do is look at what are other rents being achieved in that area. And then you can say, okay, I have an idea. So the deal then, you're able to work out approximately what the yield will be. If the yield is 10 or better, you're doing well. A lot of the time you'll look at a property deal and it'll be 4 to 5%. That's no use to you because you're borrowing money at more than that potentially. So you're going to actually have to put money into that deal every month just to sustain it. So that's not going to be much use to you. So you're looking at price, you're looking at rents, you're looking at the yield, you're looking at if you're buying a property that you're going to be renting to, where are the tenants going to be coming from? Are they going to be working in the hospital across the road or the college? Are they working for the big employer down the street? Like, you got to think about that. And if there are lots of employees nearby, is it walking distance or are they going to need transport? So is there a bus, Lewis, Metro, whatever it is that nearby? All of this impacts the price and the value of the property. And so those are two of the things that you should be thinking about. Then the third one is your personal fundamentals. And that comes down to, do you have the cash to do a deal? Like, financially, are you actually able to put the money together to do this? Also, timing. Are you trying to get into property and your partner is pregnant and you're about to have a child? And so everything's about to change in terms of timing. you're about to have a situation where your expenses are going to shoot right up. Is this the right time to be doing it? You got to kind of look at all of these factors and ask, um, do you have a job that pays you a predictable amount that this is the good time to go and do all of this? Like these are the little things that you just need to think about. But that triangle, those three lenses are what I would recommend that you use when you're looking at this stuff. If you don't, if you just kind of look at it from a, kind of removed from the whole thing, it can give you quite a bit of stress, and you can end up in a situation where you might have found a good deal, but you personally are not in a good position to go and do that deal. And this is something that you also, and we talked about it at the beginning of the call for those of you who missed it, but your tolerance to risk, all right? This is around self-awareness, okay? Self-awareness is really, really important. Do you get anxious about things that are outside of your control? If you're the kind of person who's going to lose sleep at night because the interest rates are going up and you're in a, you've bought this property now, you're in trouble. If that is your type of mindset, if you're going to suffer mental anguish over this, then is it the right time for you to be buying? You got to think about that. One of the things that I go through with my clients inside the accelerator is we talk about the MENT framework. And what that is, money. Do you have the cash? Do you have the money? And that's the first thing that people think about. They think in terms of the resources that I have available to me, money is the first one that comes to mind. So back in 2008, I got a beating by the market, and I found myself going from being really wealthy, well-to-do guy, earning far more than I could spend and feeling great about everything. Suddenly, the market crashed and the banks came in and swept in and took a huge amount of my net worth away, forced me to sell properties, did a full cash sweep on all my income. So it was a very difficult time, and that lasted about 6 years. During that time, I had no money at all. I was skint. And you might sort of say, well, that's me out of the game because I've lost all my money. But you don't have, that's not the only source of capital that you have. You have other sources of capital. The next one, E, your expertise. Your expertise is a crucial component of your personal fundamentals. And those of you on the call, I'd love actually if you guys just put in what is it that you do. Now, I know some of you would have done that at the beginning of the call tonight, but there's a lot of people who've just joined in the last little while. So please put in what is it that you do in terms of like a job or a profession or qualifications or whatever it is, because that's what we're getting at here, expertise. When I realized that the banks had sort of cleared out all the money that I had, I was in a situation where I was like, I've got no money. What can I do here? And then I realized, hold on a sec. I've got like 2020, I had about 15 years of experience back in 2010, when all of this was going on. I was like, well, actually know a lot of stuff. I'm pretty experienced in property. I've gone and done a lot of deals where I've raised a lot of money. I've met with investors. I know how to do all that kind of thing. I know how to add value to a property. So that being the case, my expertise is pretty good. So you can't take that away from me. The banks weren't able to take my expertise away. So you have to evaluate your own expertise. What is it that you do that can be of value to this process? And one of the things that I think a natural ability is, there's people out there who will say professionals like architects, like accountants that could do tax stuff. You have skills there that could actually be quite good. But then on the other side, you've got tradespeople. If you're able to do carpentry, and electrical, plumbing, all of that kind of stuff, those are all really valuable abilities that you can take into the property industry. And so you can buy a property and you can fix it up much cheaper than somebody that doesn't have those skills. So evaluate your skills, evaluate your expertise, evaluate what it is you. Then the next thing is your N, and that is your network. Who do you know? Do you have a network? Like if you opened up your phone and you were to start scrolling down through it, would you come across names who you haven't talked to for a while, but if you were to reach out to them, they might co-invest with you in the deal? Or they might know somebody who understands that there's a property coming up for sale. They might be an agent. They might be an adjoining landowner. There's always somebody in your network of people that can be of some value to you, and that can open doors. One of the best deals that I ever did in my career came about because I got a tip off from a friend of mine. I was having lunch, hadn't seen him in a while, and he said, "Oh, by the way, we're going to be selling that building soon." And I was like, "Oh, really? I had no idea. Like, which building is it?" And he told me, "Oh, we own this building and we're going to be selling it soon." I went out, took a look at it, and I was like, "Oh, wow, this is a really great building." And I said to myself, "Do you know what? I'm pretty confident that I could do quite well at this." So I went and I prepared, and I had an architect look at it, and I spoke to the bank, and the day that the property was put on the market, I was actually fully lined up, and I went and I put a bid on it, and I secured that property. And 2 months later, somebody else came along and said, "Gavin, we wanted to buy that property, but you bought it before we were ready. And so we need to buy it off you. How much will you take?" And like that was a one-off deal. I didn't do this kind of thing all the time, but that one deal in the space of about 2 months, I made a 2.5 million profit. I actually got them to pay me 2.5 million more than I just paid for it. And that was all because I had lunch with a guy that knew something that was actually able to give me just that little bit of an advantage. And then the last thing on the MENT exercise is time. Do you have time? If you have time, that's great. If you don't have, well, then you have to think about that as a resource as well. I know solicitors that work in big firms, and a solicitor working in a big firm will make lots and lots of money, but has very little time. But if you come along, let's say you're a person who has a small portfolio, it's bringing in an income, you've got some trade skills, or you're a small builder or something like that, you can come along and you can say, "Well, I've got the time, but I just don't have much money. How's that for a partnership? The two of us work together. I'll find the property and I've got the skills to do it up. You've got the readies, you put them in." Now all of a sudden you've got somebody who can help you finance getting into a deal. So it's about getting resourceful. One of the big things is just people say, "Oh, I don't have the resources." But the problem is not the resources. The problem is quite frequently you're just lacking resourcefulness. And anything can be done if you just bring about a kind of creative approach. And it's, you just got to get creative. Like a lot of the stuff that people do in property is, it's not that it's rocket science. It's just that they've approached it um, from a problem solving kind of approach. And they see it, they think to themselves, "How can I create something here? How can I create extra value that nobody else sees?" And that's how they make the money on the deal. Anyway, so guys, the next thing I'm going to talk about is, oh yeah, and one of the things, just going back on this here, we're talking about the deal fundamentals. Probably the most important one is how can you identify a way of adding value to the deal? And what a lot of people will do is they'll look at an apartment and they'll say, "I'll buy that apartment and I'll rent it out and I'll collect rent every month from the tenant." And if you think about it, from a clean investment point of view, it's fairly straightforward. But if you compare an apartment with a small house has a garden, and you can extend the house into that garden. If you buy an apartment, you can't extend up, you can't extend down, you can't extend sideways, you can't do anything. You've bought the four walls, and that's all you have to play with. So how can you add value to an apartment? Well, you can put a new carpet in, you can paint it, you can upgrade your kitchen and your bathrooms, but that's about it. Whereas with a small house, you can extend the house. You can, add an extension to the house. You can turn it into a HMO, house of multiple occupancy. You can turn it into a place that you're renting to students. You get more per room. You can extend out into the rear garden, build two extra bedrooms or whatever. Now you're adding value to it. So think about that. We've seen some big increases. Like guys have actually bought property, um, and they've added significantly to the value of it. And the benefit then is that you can go and refinance with the bank, and the bank will just give you, basically they'll give you more money, and you can go and take that money then and go and do another property somewhere else. Next, I want to talk about, well, This is, I'm going to talk about actually, just for those of you, before we get into some questions and stuff. The way I look at property, I've come up with what I call the OCV model, and this is basically how my own courses are built. And I look at three. There's the OCV, the opportunity, the capital, and the value. And those are the things that you're looking for. And the first stage when you join my program, we go through strategy. You've got to establish what is a strategy for you. If you don't know clearly what it is that your skill set combined with your financial situation, combined with your knowledge of who you know and all that, that will indicate what is a good strategy for you. Builders, people who work in construction, they tend to be very good at buying a house that can be fixed up. Somebody who comes from, say, like there's a couple of guys inside my program that are coming from professional background. They can obviously bring professional skills to the party. There's a guy in my group that he's an entrepreneur and kind of an influencer. He's got sales skill. If you're good at selling, if you're good at marketing yourself and stuff like that, then you're no longer going to be the guy that's actually doing the kind of the heavy lifting and stuff. You're the guy that can actually go out and raise money, and you can kind of pool the resources and maybe work with other people that have those skills. So your strategy is a super important thing, and you've really got to work on what's the strategy for me. I do not believe for a minute that that there's one strategy that fits everyone, and that you come in, if you come and work with me, you're all going to be going out doing exactly the same thing. I will show you what's the strategy that kind of works best for you, and then you go and look for properties that fit that strategy. After that, we get into identify. Like you've got to figure out how are you going to find the deal. If you're not able to identify good deals, if you don't know where to look for them, um, all of that, then it's kind of be a waste of time. So going back to what we looked at before, the property triangle, those fundamentals, that feeds into the identification stage. Then you've got to obviously get into negotiation. The negotiation stage is important. How do you make an offer? How do you actually advise somebody? If you're going to make an offer on a property, how do you term that? How do you go about raising the money and all of that kind of stuff? That feeds then obviously into the next stage, which is this capital raising stage. And when you get into capital, then you've got to understand how to present the numbers. The numbers are critical. If you don't know how to present numbers, then you're going to struggle chatting with the bank. But also, if you have bigger ambitions and you're thinking about growing a portfolio, like the average person who wants to be a small landlord, like 1 to 3 properties, that's something that you can achieve under your own steam. You don't really need to bring in external investors. But if you want to kind of go into multiple properties, like 5, 10, 15, 20 properties, and I know somebody that started in 2011 and today he has 650 properties. Now he's based in the UK, but very interesting guy, but he did it working with investors. And he doesn't own 100% of 650 properties, but he owns a percentage of that total amount, and he's doing really well as a result of it. So you wouldn't be able to do that. You wouldn't be able to raise the money to do that kind of thing if you have got a poor ability to articulate the way the numbers look, how to stack it up, how to explain the value and all that kind of stuff. You've obviously got to be able to structure the deal. So when we come to structuring, you've got legal and you've got tax. And a lot of people I get a question a lot from people, and it's like, Gavin, should I use a company? Should I buy in my own name? Should I do all this kind of stuff? All of that, like it's very hard to give a standard answer to that because it all depends on your situation. If you have a company producing cash, then it makes sense to have another company so you can lend it over. But if you're like, it all depends. One of the things I will say is that legal advice and tax advice, they can sometimes conflict with one another. And you can have a situation where, despite the fact that you might go to a tax guy, you might say, how do I avoid paying the maximum amount of tax? And he'll come up and say, oh, this is what you do. And this is actually how a lot of people ended up in difficulty back in 2008, because in 2008, everyone was focused on flipping properties. And so what happened was we had a situation where somebody, you go to a tax guy, And I did this myself, and I can remember getting expensive advice from Deloitte or somebody, and I asked them, how am I going to do, how am I going to pay the minimum amount of tax when I make a huge profit on this deal? And they said, oh, easy, buy it in your own name. Don't buy it in a company, because if you buy it in a company, then when you sell the property, the money goes into the company. And in order to get them, the company will pay, at the time, tax was 20%. Today it's 35%, right? But you pay 20%, and then to get that out to you, you'll have to pay another 20%. So it'd be 40%. So they said, it makes total sense. Do everything in your personal name. And so guys went out there, they went into partnership with other people. Then the crash happened. And suddenly the banks are saying, right, Gavin, you're paying this loan. And I'd say, but what about the other two guys that I borrowed the money with? No, they've gone bankrupt. It's just you. You're the one who's carrying the can for everyone. And so that was really painful. Now, if I had gone and asked a solicitor for legal advice, how do I avoid paying, the banks for other people's debts and stuff? How do I kind of keep myself completely safe? They would have said, set up a company. And so it completely conflicts with the tax advice that you would have gotten. So you've got to understand that they don't always work together in terms of a structure. And so a lot of the time, you're going to have to kind of figure out these kind of things as you go. Banking, obviously. Knowing how to present the numbers is one thing. Knowing how to structure the deal is another. Actually raising the money either from a bank or from an investor. That's the next stage. Really important stage. We teach this inside my accelerator. And once you've figured out how to raise the money and stuff like that, then it really accelerates your ability to do deals, because it's no longer dependent on you and the amount you can raise. It's actually dependent on just how convincing you are as you speak to investors, whether you can persuade them that this is a really good deal. If you put your money into this, I'm going to pay you a return of XYZ, whatever it is. And then we have got the enhance stage. Now, I talked earlier in this one here about the value add. That's what the enhanced stage is how can you add value? If you're unable to add value to a property, then the only thing that's raising the price of your property is the market rising. And if the market rises, it's going to be a slow process, you getting your money out of that deal. But if you're able to add value and enhance it in some shape, and there's lots of ways to do that, but if you're able to do that, then what you'll find is you can get your money back from the banks. You can repay investors, and you can keep the deal just by creating that little bit of extra money that allows you to refinance the property, pay back your investor, and then it's yours and you carry it forward. Obviously, the next bit, we talk about your human capital. Like, do you do everything yourself, or do you start to kind of build a small little circle of competent people that you work with? And so you need to have your accountant, you need to have your solicitor, you need to have your architect, you need to have various people, plus depending on what you need, whether your own skills are in plumbing and all that kind of stuff. This is why you build a team. And then at the end of it all, you got to review where you are, and that track record is really important. Your track record. If you took a property from an opportunity and you pursued it, we call this stage pursuit. If you pursued it through all of this stage, and then you actually took it and you bought it, you performed. Once you've performed, then you add the value to it. And once you've added the value to it, then you're able to go out and you're able to create a profile for yourself. If you've created a profile as somebody that is successful at turning deals around, being able to buy a property, add value to it, pay back your investor, do it again, refinance, go again, that makes you a very compelling investment promoter, we'll say. And you can go out there and you can do that. So that's the idea. That's what I teach inside the accelerator. If anyone is interested, we teach that. But what I wanted to say before I do the Q&A is I'm actually going to be launching something in January. And the idea is I have had what I call the foundation program for the last couple of years. And the foundation program is really for the guys looking to do 1 to 3 properties. And so accelerator is for the guys looking to build the portfolio. So we'll say 10 to 20 properties to be able to get yourself into a position where you can actually retire on the income from the property portfolio. But a lot of people are only starting out and they're saying, Gavin, I only want to just get the first 3 properties. I just want to understand how the process works for that. So I created the foundations course for that. Now, foundations, it's, you're at the beginning, 1 to 3 properties. But what I've done in the past is it was a recorded video course. I'm completely upgrading that. And what I'm going to do in January, over 12 weeks, I'm going to be doing live workshops like what we're doing right now tonight. And I'm going to be building the foundations course live over those 12 weeks. And so if anyone would like to participate in that and be on those 12 weeks of live course calls with me, I've got a special deal. And what I'll do is I'll drop it into the chat. But there's basically it'll give you the ability to be a part of that. And I've got a kind of an early bird rate for those of you who are interested in getting in on it. If you get in on it, then you'll have it for about 50% off the price that it's going to be. But one thing to remember is when this is eventually built, the only way you do foundations is as a course where you watch videos. I'm only doing this one opportunity to work with me on a kind of group call like this, where you can interact with me for 12 weeks. So we'll build a whole course over the 12 weeks, where you can actually ask questions, you can jump in, you can actually kind of drill into the detail. So there'll never be an opportunity to do live workshops with me for 12 weeks after this course is done. So it's there. I'll put a link in. Anyone who wants to join that in January, all the details will follow and stuff like that. But there's the link there if you're interested. And the price will be higher and it won't have the live workshops afterwards. So it's just for those of you, just as a little kind of reward for your time and for coming on tonight. What I'll do now is I'm going to throw open the floor for anyone who has questions. And I see there's a question there from James. So let's go in there. And guys, if you want to throw questions in the chat, I'm happy to answer some Q&A. I'll do about 20 minutes of Q&A because at this stage we're coming up to 2 hours for me. I know some of you only joined at 8:30. So let's see. Gavin, hi. Let's see. Quick question. Hoping you might point me in the right direction. I'm in the process of converting a property into a HMO and was wondering if you know any builders or contractors locally who specialize in HMO conversions, fire safety, compliance, layout optimization, even a couple of names to start. Okay. Specifically, James, what I'll do is I can reach out to you on a private message with some of those details, but there's a couple of guys in my accelerator that have done incredibly well in the HMO space. For those of you who don't know what a HMO is, I'll explain on this slide here. Okay, so let me just make sure that I'm showing you guys the right slide. Yeah, okay, that's good. So the situation with the slide with property, when you're doing a property, you can obviously rent it to a family, and that's what most people are doing is they rent out the property to a family, and maybe they're getting 2,500 a month, and the 2,500 a month is for the family to move in, and maybe they got a couple of kids that go to the school and whatever, and so that's the way it works. When you go into the HMO space, it's different. What we have with HMO is it's a little bit like a student accommodation. What you're doing instead is you're basically splitting the house up into bedrooms, okay? So let's say the downstairs living room, that gets turned into a bedroom. Then you've got maybe 4 beds upstairs. Those are all bedrooms. So bedroom 1, bedroom 2, bedroom 3, bedroom 4. I mentioned before the ability to add value. So if you buy an apartment, there's no extending it. But if you've gone and bought a house with a small garden, maybe you can add an extension to the rear. Now you go and add bedroom 5, bedroom 6, and then this what was your living room has just become bedroom 7. Now, obviously it depends where in the country you are, but here in Dublin, you'd be getting about $850 per room per month. So do the maths on that transaction, and you will see that that property deal now is producing per month. How does that compare to this? Like, that is one of the reasons why people are going into HMOs. Now, HMO does not come without risks. And the risks are that there is no regulation currently governing HMO. So at the moment, you can go and do it. Nobody stops you. But if you look at the UK, in the UK, there is a huge amount of regulation around HMOs. You cannot build a HMO without a license. You have to have permission. Sometimes the local authority will only allow so many HMOs in a particular area. And so, that being the case, if the government decides a couple of years from now or next week that, you know what, we want to go and we want to regulate HMOs, then you could suddenly find that you've gone and done all of this work, and you're making this amount of money every month, so you're doing really, really well, only to find that, sorry, you can't do that anymore. You need to get a license. You need to apply for a license. So there's a couple of risks around it. But for the vast majority of people that are in my group, they've been doing it for the last 5 or 6 years. There's never been any trouble. And some of them now are getting up close to, like, at least one or two that I'm aware of are doing over seven figures a year in in income from HMOs. They've built a substantial portfolio from it, and so it's a really big money spinner, um, and it allows you to throw so much cash flow out that you can pay down your debt quickly, or you can accumulate enough money to actually go and do another property. So you just go on to the next one, onto the next one, onto the next one. Now, that is not as simple as it looks drawn on this. It's not that simple. Like, you don't just go out and do this. Things like, if you're going to put in 7 bedrooms, then you want to significantly upgrade your fire system. First of all, it needs to be like a commercial fire system. But second of all, your kitchen, you're going to have 2 fridges, you're going to have 2 freezers, you're going to have 2 cookers, you're going to have 2 washing machines, because you got so many people in the house that they're all on top of each other if you don't have that kind of capacity. And if you've got a load of people on top of each other, what's going to happen is they are going to get frustrated with one another, and then they're going to get into rows, and then you start having churn with people leaving the property and stuff like that. Um, One of the questions, James, in your experience for HMO, would you suggest letting agent or going DIY? The thing is with HMO is it does become quite busy. So that would all depend. I know a lot of people were doing HMO a few years ago, and it was really good time to do it. Now there's a bit more saturation in the market, more people doing it, and there can be more churn. Like, you bring in a load of people that are strangers, there can be all sorts of friction between them. And so that can cause somebody to leave. And so you're back in renting it again or whatever. So there can be it can be a bit more hands on. Also, you got to be careful about bills and things like that, because the bills, when you are a landlord of a HMO, you have to cover the bills. So you're covering the electricity, the gas, the water, whatever it is. And if you have tenants that are not paying the bills, what happens a lot of the time is they abuse. They're kind of like, we've found that in the middle of winter, there'll be a guy, walking around in his t-shirt. The window will be wide open in his room, and he's got the heat blasting. And so you're paying 2 grand a month on for the electricity bill on that place. And so what some of the guys have done, they're very professional now, is they've gone in and they've actually rewired it so that it's all on sensors. So the moment that person opens the window, the heating system turns off. And they've even done it so that individual bedrooms are plumbed directly to the heating system. So one person living in one room opens the window, his heat goes off, but the guy next door hasn't been affected. And so it's completely individualized. And there's a fair bit of work in that, but it allows him to control costs much, much better. And you can control the costs so well that it's effectively like adding another bedroom to the house. You can reduce your bills by 800-900 a month, and that is equivalent to adding another bedroom to the. So sometimes it's worth making those investments. Um, you're doing a 5 bed at the moment, James. That sounds like a good deal. And where it's located, um, the Dublin 15 area, it's close to colleges, it's close to hospital, and it's not such a long drive away from the big employers like Intel and stuff like that. So I would say that that's a pretty good deal. But let me see. I've got some more questions. I think we have five. How much is? Let me have a look. So, hi Gavin. January course, the foundation. The January course is foundations. So, I'm running the accelerator all the time. The accelerator, but the foundation course, the way it was designed, the way it has been designed to date, is that it is simply a video. You watch it in your own time, and there's a series of videos. You watch them. It explains everything. I created that about 5 years ago, so I want to completely update it and modernize it and everything like that. And so it's going to be a little bit like this. There'll be a workbook for each of the 12 weeks. So there'll be 12 lessons, 12 workshops, we'll say, live workshops like this. And afterwards, the videos from that live workshop will go into the course. And so only the people buying this foundations course that I'm talking about in January, the only people who'll be buying that will be getting the live workshops with me. Afterwards, there won't be live workshops. It'll be available as a video course that you just buy and watch. Specific dates. The dates, it'll be like I'm going away on the 21st to the 31st of January. So it might not be every single week, but it's definitely going to be the first couple of weeks of January, then into February, then into March. Now, they'll all be recorded. So if you do happen to miss one, you can go and watch it again. But the idea would be that you join live and you watch the whole thing in a live workshop like this, where you can ask questions. And usually the live interaction is a bit more engaging than watching videos. But obviously with videos, you can kind of watch it in your own time and stuff. So the dates, it'll be January, it'll be 12 weeks, but it may not be 12 consecutive weeks. It might be 3 weeks, then a break, then another couple of weeks after that, because you've got, various holidays and stuff like that. Angelo wants to say, bought my first house recently back in August with Help to Buy. It's my primary home. Location is Waterford. Currently renting out one room, which a lot of people do. There's good tax break on that. Would you recommend going straight for my second home straight away, or actually looking into commercial units instead? Angelo, I would say commercial can be kind of like, I like commercial, but there's a fair bit of a learning curve in commercial. Commercial is not valued the same way that residential is. If you look at this as an example, so there's a house there that we've drawn. Let's say this is a commercial unit next door. This is exactly actually the configuration that I'm going to tell you about. One of the first commercial deals that I ever did was in Clondalkin. And what I did was I bought this big unit, big rectangular unit like this. And I can remember I paid I think it was 680,000 for this unit. Okay. Oh, wait, sorry. I'm after going to the wrong page. There we go. 680 grand. Okay. Now, the thing was, as far as I can remember, it was about 4,700 square feet in floor area. It was all ground floor unit, and it had an entrance here. And so I looked at that and I thought to myself, whoa, that's a very big unit. What that's going to be is somebody's going to move into that, and 4,000, like, think about, an average size house is only like 1,800 square feet. So this unit was about 2.5 to 3 times the size of an average house. So very big unit. I thought to myself, who am I going to be able to rent that to? The only person I can really rent that to is probably a carpet showroom or some place that needs lots of space. And a carpet showroom would probably pay about €12 per square foot. Now, if you were renting 4,000, I'll do the maths here, 4,700 square feet at €12 per square foot, then the most I could get per year on that would be about 56K. All right. So that's just 12 times 4,700. Okay. Now, so what I decided to do was, you know what I can do instead? I'll go and speak to one of my estate agent friends who does commercial and find out what does he think about this as a deal. And so he said, Gavin, if you split the units, we can get a higher rent. So what I did is I applied for planning permission to put a wall in the unit there, and to put a wall in the unit there, and then put in another door here and another door here. Now, we had to go for planning permission from the local authority to do that. So got planning permission. And then what we had to do is the way it works was that one unit had an electrical supply board, ESB supply there in the corner. What I had to do is get an electrician to go and put one in to this unit as well, and to put one into this unit as well. So he had to go and rewire the place to be able to do that. And then what we had to do is you obviously need to have a toilet. So in this unit, there was a hole in the ground, and you basically connect a toilet to that and water and whatever, and that would have been your toilet. So what we did is got a Kango hammer and created another pipe in there and another pipe in there. Once those works were done, it didn't cost that much. It cost maybe all in maybe 60 grand to do the work to those units. These were not fancy units. They were boarded up. And what I did then is ask the estate agent, will you go out and when you rent, try and find tenants for these? So we managed to get a pizza place in this unit. We managed to get an off license in this unit. And this one in the middle was hard to find somebody for a while, but we ended up getting a bookies. The rents they were paying, though, were €40 a foot, €45 a foot, and 35 euro a foot. So suddenly we had a situation where the average rent was now €40 a foot. So 4,700 times 40, our rent went to 188,000. From 56 to 188. And the way commercial property is valued, it's based on the income. Whereas house prices, it's based on the prevailing prices in that area. So if you bought this house in, we'll say, the Dublin 16 area for 300 grand, well, the one next door is probably also worth about 300 grand. It doesn't matter whether you're getting twice the rent next door, it's still only worth about 300 grand in the eyes of a valuer that works for the bank. Whereas over here, this property earning 56 grand a year, it's not as valuable as a property earning 188,000 a year. So what I did anyway was got those guys in, they started paying the rent, they get rent freeze and they get various things. This is why when I say getting into commercial, it's not as straightforward as getting into residential. There is a lot more to learn, but once you've learned that, you can do this kind of deal. What I ended up doing was selling that property at a 5% yield. And so 5% yield, the way yields work and all that kind of stuff, I won't complicate it any further, but basically I sold it at 20 times the income that it was producing. So 188K times 20, 3.76 million. That's what I was able to sell that property for, having bought it for 680. So that was over 3 million profit made on that deal. And it took no more than about 18 months. That's why, for me, commercial is the way to go. Residential, it's not as attractive to me. And the reason is that you are competing with families that are trying to buy a home. If you're competing with a family trying to buy a home, leaving aside, the whole landlord, and landlord is the enemy kind of narrative that's out there. But a family that's trying to buy a home has a huge emotional driver. Whereas an investor is thinking, how can I get the maximum return? And if you're bidding against families that are trying to find a home, you're going to find that they'll overpay for the property because it's emotional. Whereas you'll be there, no, can't make a return that's worth it at that price. So you'll end up being outbid by others. So for me, I'd rather buy commercial property than get caught up in struggling to kind of find value against families and things like that. So unless it's a fixer-upper house where you're buying a house, or unless it's a really big, in fact, just one of the guys in the group during the week, he bid on a property in Carlow, and it was right next door to Carlow University, so it was a very obvious student housing thing. But that property was going to be like, in the end, it went above what he was able to raise money for, so he didn't get it. But we figured that property would probably produce an annual yield of about 25%. Now, if you're getting 25% yield from your property, it means that the rental income you collect in just 4 years, you have fully repaid the price that you purchased that property for. That's how much income was being driven off that property. 4 years, full payback of all your money. So there is still value out there. And I think a lot of people are kind of feel like market's too pricey, can't find value anywhere, not going to bother. And so that's one of the reasons why people are still joining my accelerator. So I would say, Angelo, learning commercial property is a really good skill, but it's one that takes a little bit of a while, a little bit of nuance to it. It's not something that I don't think you'd be able to go out and get into commercial right away. I think there would be too many risks. The problem with, like, as attractive as I've made this deal look, I also have to tell you that I tried to do exactly the same deal elsewhere and I lost over 600 grand because I got it wrong. And I tried to rent it to a tenant. The tenant said they'd go in. Then after I bought it, they decided not, they changed their mind. And it took me 9 years. That unit was empty for 9 years. And during that time, I was paying interest. The bank ended up forcing me to sell it. So I lost 600 grand on that deal. So commercial can go very badly wrong, much quicker than a residential property can go badly wrong. So you really have to know what you're doing. So I wouldn't recommend you go into commercial, but by all means, if you're sorted now in the property, then, look to get back, like look to go again. What I will say, you got to be careful. Here's one little bit of information to be aware. I'm throwing out all the goodies tonight. If you're buying your first property, you're buying a home, okay? Banks will lend you 90%. You only have to come up with 10%, and you can get the thing like the help to buy and all that kind of stuff, okay? That's great. So it's easy to pay for the first one. When you're going for the second one, okay, what some of the guys have done, and one in particular got caught this way, right? He went to the bank and did this, and what he did was he actually turned it into a HMO. He said that he was buying a home, but he turned it into a HMO. He started making some really good cash off of it, and the value of the property went up by I think about 40K, right? So he only put 18,000 in. He bought it. I think he's out in the west of Ireland, so I think it cost 120 grand to buy the property. But after doing it up and stuff, it was valued at 160. So he was up 40 grand. And he said, okay, I want to go to the bank and I want to release that 40 and I want to go and do it again. Because he only put 18 into this. So he reckoned if I can get a profit of 40, then I can actually do this a few more times. So he went to the bank and he said, I want to buy a home. Um, can you lend me 90% and I'll put down 10%? And they're like, absolutely, we can. Where do you want to buy? And he told them, I want to buy this. This is house number one. I want to buy house number two. They're like, okay, great. What are you going to do at house number one? And he was like, oh, um, well, I'm renting that now. The moment he said that, they're like, okay, well, we only lend 70% on rental property, not 90%. So we need you to give us 30%. You've already paid 10, but we need you to put in the other 20. At this stage, he was able to say, well, I've added 40. But basically that 40 went into, it was kind of absorbed because of that. So you got to be careful. The banks look at rental property as a 70% loan. They look at a home as a 90% loan. And so you got to be careful you don't get caught with that little price difference there, Um, how much is my tax per month? My tax per month? Well, it depends on, different properties. Like we have got commercial properties, they're inside of companies, all that. So the tax can be very different. Leveraging property seems very difficult to do through an equity release. Is it easier to get leverage on property as a sole trader? Yeah, limited, like one of the best ways, if you are a sole trader or if you're one of the like some of the guys inside my accelerator, the vast majority of them would be either business owners or they would be tradespeople that are earning good money as electrician, plumber, builder, carpenter, whatever it is. And what they'll do is they'll set up a second company. So if you've got, let's say this is your company and customers are paying you, and so you're making some good money into this property, into this company here. You only have to pay 12% tax on the income that comes into a limited company. So what people do is once they start having a surplus, they want to go and buy a property with it. And the problem is if you pay yourself out of the company, you're going to pay 50% tax or 52% tax. So instead, what we do is we set up what we call a holding company, and that owns the shares in your trading company. And what you do is you set up another company, which is going to be a property company, and you can lend the money, like the surplus cash in here, you lend it to the holdco, and it lends it down here, and then you go and you buy property. Now, that's one of the ways to do it. And the other thing that's beneficial, if you go down the road of a HMO, and this is the stuff that we get into inside the program, so I won't go into too much detail here, but you can get your tax rate down to 12.5% as a trading business rather than the 52%. If you own the property yourself, then the rent that you're collecting is at 52%. So there's all sorts of benefits. Property co is usually 25%, but it depends on the activity. If you're doing short-term rentals or if you're doing HMO stuff, that can be taxed at 12.5%. So thoughts on pre-63 multi-unit and investment, given the planning restrictions, is there a compliant way to leverage Airbnb? I would say Airbnb in Dublin city centre is like very difficult now. And so you want to be careful with that. Like you're getting down, like I haven't looked at the rules recently, but I know I tried to do something similar not so long ago. And I can remember I was only able to keep it for something like 90 days. and it was only I could only use it as short-term rental for like 90 days of the year, something like that. So there was a lot of restrictions on it. So like pre 63, you're nearly better off. I mean, the March 2026 thing is going to create some issues around pre 63 potentially. So but I do have a client that's quite successful, and he's got a good cash flowing business, and he's bought multiple pre 63s in the last year or two. And so it's still like quite a lucrative thing. Usually they're located in good parts of the city where there's a fairly big demand. The question is whether you do a lease or a license. And that's where I'll finish up tonight. If you do a lease, you register with the RTB. And once you register with the RTB, all the rules come in about how much you can rent it for and all that kind of stuff. When we do HMOs and stuff, we're doing a license. And the thing about the license is that it doesn't give that person the RTB, it doesn't give them those same rights. And so it also means that you're actually able to earn 12.5% tax rather than the higher tax, because it's effectively a trading business. You're doing kind of short term letting. And so that has been beneficial. A lot of the guys in the group have gone down that road. And that's that's what they do rather than tying it up in the RTB. There's a lot of headaches. The RTB might have been set up for the right reasons, but like there's huge capacity issues in terms of getting cases addressed. I know a couple of guys in the group have had some real problems, and the 18 months getting a case resolved, somebody stops paying your rent. 18 months later, they're still not paying your rent, and the RTB still hasn't made a decision. So quite a difficult. Any issues splitting rooms in a duplex? I don't see like I don't know, off the top of my head, I don't see an issue, but I've given up architecture a while back, so I don't know all the ins and outs and stuff. Like one of the reasons why I talked about team earlier is you really do need to you need to have a good team that you can pick up the phone, you can get some good answers from. If you're about to do something and you've got somebody that you can rely on to ask a question, either it's a tax guy, a legal guy, or some sort of person that understands planning, fire, health and safety, all of those are answers that are super important. The last thing I'll leave you with is when it comes to the law, important to kind of point out that health and safety law is a criminal law matter. All right. So if you go and you build something without planning permission, you'll get a rap on the knuckles. But if you go and, do a house up and then don't actually put in a good fire system or something, and there's a fire and people die, you'll spend time in jail because it's a criminal issue, and it's a criminal complaint. And you can't say, I didn't know that I needed to put in a fire alarm. You will actually go to jail. And so health and safety law is governed by the Criminal Act. And so you have to be really careful. Make sure that you don't cut corners or any of that kind of stuff there, because especially if you're doing something like a HMO, because you're into multiple people living in a house under the same roof, they don't necessarily know each other. And so you want to make sure that there's good health and safety there. All right, guys. Does anyone have any final questions? I'm going to wind it up there. We've been going for over 2 hours now, so my feet are getting tired. Nice to see you guys. I hope you found that one useful. Does anyone want to share any takeaways or any questions, final questions they have? And I'll say good night. All right, guys. Nice to see you. Signing off, and I'll do it. I'll be doing another one another one of these in January. I was going to say I'll do one in December, but because it's the crazy month with Christmas and all that, I'm not sure about Christmas, but certainly want to do one of these in early January, and it might be to kick off the foundations. All right. Networking events in Dublin. I do a networking event for my members in February, first Saturday of February. And so those of you who join the foundations will be able to come to that as well. So, all right, guys, take care. Thanks for the comments and everything, and catch you in the next one.